That's great. So next up we have Stephanie McClelland, and I don't know about you, but in my past life as a developer, I always hated documentation. So Steph's going to talk about documentation and I suppose how to do it and make it bearable, I suppose. So just give a warm welcome to Steph as she comes up on stage. So thank you, Steph.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm so pleased to be here today and want to thank everyone at Women Tech Makers Belfast for all their hard work putting together this conference, and what a brilliant day we've had so far. My presentation today is titled Documentation Avoidance. The struggle is real, but success depends on it. This afternoon I'll be talking about the ways and means of documenting an API and the benefits that it can bring, but first I'll tell you a wee bit about me. That's me on the left there, Stephanie, but most people call me Steph. I live in County Armagh with my husband, Stephen, and my daughter, Elsie Violet. The wee creature on the right there, that's Shelby. She's my other daughter, she's a bit more furry than Elsie, but anyway. As a senior full-stack developer at GCD Technologies, I work as part of a team building custom software and mobile apps to help ambitious businesses innovate and push boundaries. That's part of my job I love. You never know what type of business you could be working with next. We're like a family at GCD, quite literally. Some of us are related. I work with my sister Lauren, she's up there somewhere. And we're a growing company. We're currently recruiting some fabulous roles if you want to check out our website. But that's enough of that. We'll get on to the good stuff. Oh, sorry. Oh, I missed a wee slide there. Oh, okay. So I'm going to be talking about documenting APIs today. So a good place to start is, what is an API? So an API stands for Application Programming Interface, and it's basically a set of definitions and protocols that enable two software components to communicate with each other without having to know what's going on behind the scenes and how they're implemented. So APIs are brilliant. They allow the integration of new application components into existing architectures, and they aid the collaboration of businesses, help development teams to avoid them having to reinvent the wheel for common functions. They're absolutely everywhere. You might not realise it, but you use them every day. You've probably used them already, whether you're updating your social media or you're trying to find out how to get here today. I know I've been using them flat out. Yeah, the reliance on APIs is increasing. There was a survey, the Rapid Developer 2022 State of APIs survey, and they found that over 62% of developers reported relying on APIs more in 22 than in 21, and they're expecting this to increase again in 23. More developers are reporting working on partner-facing or third-party APIs. Along with this popularity of APIs predicted to rise, the survey reported the expectation for more businesses to monetize, so they're actually going to try and make money out of the use of APIs. But to be able to do this, they have to be well consumed, and a vital part of that is for consumers to understand and appreciate the value of it. And to know the value of an API, you need to know how to use it, and that's where documentation comes in. So, the life cycle of an API. It consists of three core aspects that take it from conception to development and finally retirement. The first stage of that is design, which involves mapping out the required resources and operations along with the use cases for the consumer before you actually begin writing the code. That's the second part then, the implementation, which focuses on implementing the logic, and it basically follows the same principles as any other software development project. The third and final, managed stage, it encompasses quite a lot. It's the testing, deployment and the eventual retirement of an API. So whilst testing should be carried out continuously throughout the development, it's carried out here to make sure that the API actually fulfills the requirements outlined during design, and when this is achieved, then it can actually be deployed to consumers. So for a presentation documentation, you might notice there's no big documentation stage here. And the reason for that being is I believe documentation should be thought about continuously throughout the life cycle of an API. It shouldn't just be a tick box exercise at the start of a project where you fire up a quick readme, and it shouldn't be a quick gathering of thoughts prior to release. In order for it to be valuable, it should be thought about at every single stage. So if we want to take a look at the tools we can use at different stages of this life cycle in order to generate documentation that ensures we deliver the best product that we can. So it's handy to think of API documentation kind of like a user manual that tells developers how to use it, how to integrate it. And it might be useful for it to have a quick start guide, tutorials, and documentation that is interactive to allow them to actually test the API endpoints. But it really needs to have an example for every endpoint, every parameter, and every response, as well as a description of what each endpoint does. And vital responses and error messages are also good in there. As primary consumers of APIs, developers need comprehensive and accurate information to be able to integrate them. Good documentation leads to good user experience and the overall success. So if your API is well documented, developers will recommend it to their peers. But believe me, if it's non-existent or inadequate, they'll discourage others from using it, just going from their own experience. Documentation has been shown to reduce the time and cost of support. By providing detailed error descriptions and troubleshooting, it'll allow the developers to go and find the answers for themselves without having to go to support. Also internally, documentation helps reduce the amount of time spent onboarding new developers so they can learn how the API works by reading the documentation. It's always a good test of how good your docs are. So good API docs, they take team effort and a commitment to maintain throughout the development lifecycle, but what exactly makes them good and what practices can we follow? Know your audience. Keep in mind the people you're writing the docs for. This will give you a clear understanding of the scope and purpose of your API so that you can write useful content and it addresses the needs of your users. Be consistent. Be consistent in your use of terminologies and well-established conventions throughout your docs. This means that users are more likely to use your API instinctively without having to trawl through massive lengths of text about why you did things differently. It makes your documentation easier to read and your API easier to use. Give examples if you can. Interactive examples allow developers to actually test the API endpoints, learn more about how they work, and hopefully that will reduce the challenges they face during integration. And please keep it up to date. APIs are continuously evolving in order to meet changing user requirements. This can easily lead to documentation becoming outdated, causing developers issues during development, giving them a hard time, headaches. In order to prevent this, processes can be put in place to ensure that documentation is manually updated whenever changes are made, or we can make this process automatic when the docs are derived from the code. I'll get to this later. But first of all, let's take a wee look at a few examples of companies who really excel at documenting their API, highlighting the best features of each one. So first up, we'll take a look at Stripe. Stripe is a payment processing platform. A really nice feature of their docs is their development quick start guide. They also provide a good variety of code examples in a range of client libraries. All their API definitions are easily accessible and searchable, and they provide an extensive sample responses, including any errors that you might face. It really has everything a developer needs to get started, presented in a clear and concise manner. They also have nice wee developer tutorials as well, which are handy. Yeah. We'll just move on to the next one, which is Slack. So Slack is an instant messaging program for teams, and they've really kept in mind their audience while writing their docs. They call it developer docs and guides. They've included a wee difficulty rating at the top there, which helps users recognise the parts of the docs that they're aimed at. So on pages like this aimed at beginners, we can see how they use less technical jargon and more detailed explanations. But this is a definition for an API endpoint, and you can see how it's more tech terms there. So yeah, very good detailed API docs there, examples of all responses. And they also have this nice wee tester tool that I think I'll show you here, which actually lets a developer go in, put parameters in, and get an actual response back, which is very nice. Finally, is Dropbox. So Dropbox is a file hosting service. It's our final example, and their docs provide an extensive guide to their API endpoints here. So you'll be able to see a clickable list of them on the right. Great detail in their API content, and there's even a nice little testing tool for each one. What's really great about these docs, I think I'll get to it later, is they provide, they let the user select a programming language, and a good range of them there, and then it provides tailored documentation for how to implement in that specific language. And this again demonstrates the practice of keeping their audience in mind. That's just the wee testing tool there, and then this is where you can select what language you're developing in, and it'll give you tailored guides. Okay, so specification first, it's also known as design first, and it's a relatively new approach to API development where a contract is defined before any code's written. So the contract of an API is a shared understanding between the provider and the consumer about what the API should be capable of. It can be written in a readable format such as YAML or JSON. Most developers, including myself, have previously followed a code-first approach to API development where we just dive straight into getting it done, implementing the endpoints, and make use of packages that generate the API specification after the fact. Whilst this approach makes it look like you're making good progress and fast-tracks the speed development, in my experience it can compromise the quality of an API based upon how it actually meets the stakeholder requirements. So the most commonly used definition for APIs is the Open API specification, formerly known as Swagger. The API specification allows us to describe all endpoints, the operations in each endpoint, parameters and authentication methods. So Swagger has developed a set of tools to help us design and develop REST APIs. That includes SwaggerUI, where we can actually write an Open API specification. So I'm going to spend a bit of time now demonstrating the features of this, whilst giving an overview of the processes involved in this approach. The first step is the process, it's the design and creation of the Open API spec. So I think I have a wee demo here. I'm just going to speed it up so it skips past all my titles. Yeah. So Swagger Editor here is a free open source tool available online at editor.swagger.io. When you first access it, you see how it loaded an example there, which allows us to see how that split view feature works. But we're starting on a blank slate, so we've cleared the editor there. You can load an existing API if you already have a specification. You can load in and view it. But for the purpose of this demonstration, I'm going to be documenting a couple of endpoints for the commonly used CATS API. So after the first line, we are just setting a bit of configuration details there, setting the type and version of the specification. This can just basically be used to describe what the API does. So I've created a first endpoint there, which is a CATS path, and it's a get endpoint. And the summary of this is just list all the CATS. We can go on here to define, I'm just giving it a bit of description there, define our first response, which is a 200 successful response, giving it a description, and it's going to have some content as well, and that's going to be the data that we will expect to see back on this endpoint, which in this case is just going to be a list of items which are CATS, and they're going to have a few properties, name, age, breed, things like that. To reduce time, to save time whenever we're writing out this specification and the length of the actual length of the document, we can define a custom reusable component here, just down in the components section. So we're creating that there. You can see we are giving it some required properties, name and age. It's of type object, and they're just the properties there with their types. I'll give some examples. Breed is an optional one there. So you can see after I've typed all that out, if we go back up to items, then I can reference that component. I'll just skip on here. Yeah, so you can see down in the schemas there, the object's coming back, and then the example response is bringing back the object as well. That just gives you a bit of a guide on how that tool can be used. But yeah, I think we've seen enough, so we'll skip off to the benefits of the specification first approach. So I find one of the major benefits of this approach is that for whoever is going to implement or integrate the API, they can actually start in their implementation without having to wait for the API to be released, because they're going to know exactly the shape the API will have, what parameters are expected, what endpoints are available, and what responses. So they could even build out their own API harness and mock-out responses, so they're not waiting on the API to be completed and released. Feedback can also be received quicker, and it's more value because the implementation details aren't getting in the way. You're not focusing on wee details in the code. And it also helps to ensure that a developer experience is positive by having these docs in place from the start. Yeah, so we've got to this point, we have a contract in place, and we're flying. The stakeholders are happy for now, and the developers are really itching to get doing some coding. But what happens to our docs? How can we ensure that what we're actually implementing meets the requirements and doesn't break that contract that we've worked so hard to put in place, and that the docs maintain up to date and they're the most recent version. So we could put processes in place during code review to ensure that the specification is updated manually on every change to the API. If not, then it doesn't get approved and doesn't get merged. But this process relies very heavily on members of the team to actually do the updates and to check for them, things can slip through the cracks whenever you're under pressure with a release or a hotfix going out. So a better way would be to automate this process. So if only we could generate a specification from the actual code, then there would be one source of truth. So to demonstrate this process, I'll be creating a small REST API project using Nest. A Swagger plugin can be used to document our API, just using simple decorators within the code, and we're not actually having to touch that specification file at all. So Nest.js is a framework for building efficient, scalable Node.js server-side applications, and I'm going to be using it today to actually start our Cats API and demonstrate how we can use those Tiger or Swagger tools to generate the specification. So first, just this wee command here, we'll start up a new Nest.js project by running nest new cats. Then, using the Nest.js client, I can quickly generate a Cats CRUD REST API. So during this, whenever you run it, it asks you, what transport layer do you want to use? So we'll select REST, and then it asks, do you want us to generate you a CRUD? Yes, please. Next step, install the Swagger packages we'll need. And now there's a bit of work here to do, just in it's a main.ts TypeScript file, just to set up our API specification document. So that config object there, we're just defining the Swagger document configuration properties, so giving it a title, description, and version. And then we can pass that config into another function there on the Swagger module, passing in our application instance, and that gives us back a document, which then we call a setup method on the Swagger module, passing in the path to the API doc and then the instance and the document we've created. So we can boot up our API here. Hopefully it runs. Oh, there we go. And if we go to localhost/API, then we can view our interactive API spec. You can see all the endpoints there that we would expect. But if you just want to view the JSON, then you can go to API/JSON. And you see the JSON of the specification there. Oh. Okay, so to begin customization of our documentation, we start in this controller file and we add a tag for the Cats API just to give it a bit of detail about what endpoint section we're writing about. So we use the API tag decorator there. Now we can create a data transfer object, also known as a DTO, which basically it provides a guideline to the consumers about what structure they can expect the request body to be and what actually makes up the properties of a cat. So we use API property decorators there. We have 3 properties. We give them a type and a description. The third one there, breed, is optional. So we use a different decorator there, API property optional. And then if we spin up our API there again, you should see that the create cat DTO in the schema has those details. And they're also brought back on the endpoint there. Now we can add some response decorators. So if we see here where we have a get endpoint and we have 3 response decorators added there, API OK, bad request, and forbidden. And then we can see how they're coming through on the endpoint as well. That's that. So Nest.js actually features an opt-in OpenAPI CLI plugin, which can save time declaring all these decorators manually by automatically annotating all the DTO properties based on their TypeScript form. So setting them to be required and optional, giving them a type or a default property. This in a large project would save a fair amount of time, and then the code being the single source of truth. But a drawback of this approach to automating API documentation is that developers still have to add a bit of information in there for the description and things, because it's not automatically generated. The plugin's not going to know what that endpoint actually does. So for it to be a useful API documentation, that still has to be done. There's also packages available for other languages. I've used Nest.js Swagger here, but there's There's also SwaggerJS doc or Swagger PHP. And that brings my presentation to the end. I hope I've highlighted the importance of a well-documented API and given you some insight into the approaches and tools that you could use to write great API specifications for yourself. Documentation takes effort even with these tools, but it is critical to boost the adoption of APIs, give developers a better experience and reduce support costs. Thank you so much for your attention. If there's time for questions, we can have some, but thank you.